sit in front.
Hey, Tony. Hey, you bet. No problem. How you doing? Oh, hey, Danny. Good to see you.
The screening process to get in here, you know.
Right, man.
How are you?
Tony, good to see you, buddy. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Good day to those joining us virtually. My name is Zainab Usman. Very nice to have you all here. I think I know a lot of people in the room, and hopefully a lot of people joining us virtually. But for those who are new to Carnegie, coming here for an event, for dialogue, my name is Zainab Usman. I'm the founding director of the Africa Program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you again for joining us for this important discussion on the future of U.S.-Africa relations in the incoming Trump administration. At the Carnegie Endowment's Africa Program, we focus on the economic, the political, and the transnational issues shaping Africa today and into the future. We do this by producing technical analyses on key policy areas, be it energy and climate, or trade, or investments, or digital technologies. We also crucially convene policy dialogues with select policymakers and analysts, such as the event we're here for today. We are fortunate to be joined this morning by a panel of eminent experts, whom I will introduce in a moment. But before then, please allow me to offer a few framing remarks to contextualize why we're here today and why we're going to have this discussion. We are in the midst of a momentous political transition here in Washington, D.C. President-elect Donald Trump will be returning to the White House come January 20th, 2025. He has a decisive political mandate. And even before the inauguration, he and his team are moving at lightning speed to advance a very transformative policy agenda, both domestically but also abroad. The African continent, as the rest of the world, will be affected by these impending policy shifts in the US. And therefore, a few questions come to mind. What does the future of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, that's a trade preference program that I'm sure most of you are aware of, what does its future look like within a scenario of maybe 20% tariffs on all imports to the US? That's just one example. Are we likely to see a shift towards a few selective bilateral free trade agreements between the US and maybe a few countries on the continent? Will Africa lose access to the US market, even as China has just announced that it will provide duty-free access to its market to the world's least developed countries, 33 of which are in Africa? If the incoming administration intends to prioritize bilateral international relationships, what will the engagement be like with countries on the continent, from Angola to South Africa to Egypt to Ethiopia to Kenya to South Africa, Nigeria, Senegal, Tanzania, and a whole range of others? How about US engagement with the evolving multilateral system? The recent BRICS expansion, which included African countries, Egypt and Ethiopia specifically, could pose significant challenges and perhaps provide some alternatives to the Western-led global economic order. The African Union's recent joining of the G20 is a watershed moment for the continent in terms of its agency and visibility within this global system. What could be the implications of America's retrenchment, if it were to retrench, that is, we don't know, for both the US and its partners from this very dynamic global landscape? What about the global energy transition? Would President-elect Trump's pledge to loosen restrictions on the fossil fuel industry resonate with African oil producers who are reliant on the proceeds from these hydrocarbons to fund their national development? What would be the approach to engaging with African countries rich in the minerals and metals that are critical to the renewable energy and electric mobility technologies of our emerging global economy? What will be the role of the US in global development and indeed the future of USAID? That's the US Agency for International Development. This is all within a context of an increasing reduction in foreign aid flows from several European countries, the top donors, be it Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, etc. They're all reducing their foreign aid budgets. And also within the context of constrained fiscal space across many African countries. The answers to these questions may not be entirely known today, but I thought to pose them anyways, because these are the things a lot of us are thinking about. However, the experts we have here with us are uniquely positioned to at least provide useful insights into the likely possibilities. And that really is the essence of this conversation today. We're not necessarily answering questions, but I thought that with the with the incoming administration, with the transition that is really upon us, there's a lot of speculation going on. And personally, I tend to be I get a little bit impatient with speculation. I like to bring people who have something to share. And that really is the motivation for this discussion today. How can we learn from the first Trump administration in terms of the approach to Africa at the time? What were some of the misconceptions that we might have had? What could be important information that would be useful to us in really navigating the second Trump administration? I would like to introduce our panelists now. And as I do so, please make your way up to the stage. I'm going to start with the Africa Program's own Ramsey Day. Ramsey is a non-resident scholar here at the Carnegie Africa Program. He joined us a couple of months ago. He is the head of strategy and business development at Luminix USA, a leading AI technology firm. He's based in California. Previously, he held several positions at the US Agency for International Development, including serving as the Assistant Administrator for Africa. Good to see you, Ramsey. Do you want to come up, please? A round of applause.
Where do you want me? Yeah.
And then we have Frank Fannon. He's a Managing Director of Fannon Global Advisors. Previously, he served as the inaugural Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources at the US Department of State. With extensive experience in the private sector, he's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a non-resident senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you very much for being here with us, Frank. Round of applause, please. Then last but not least, we have Tibor Nagy. He is Professor Emeritus at Texas Tech University, and he has spent well over 20 years on various assignments, senior assignments across Africa, including several ambassadorial positions. He served as the US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs at the State Department from 2018 to 2021. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so well, we're going to start now, but before we do, maybe a brief run of show. We're going to have each of the panelists give opening remarks for about maybe 7 minutes. That's kind of segment one. Segment two, we're going to talk about what could likely come in the Trump 2.0, basically the incoming administration. And then segment three, we're going to open up for questions and answers. So I'm going to start now probably with Tibor. And my general question, I suppose, to Tibor, but also to everyone here is, what is your perspective on the evolution of the first Trump administration's approach to Africa? How did this affect the policy development and directives set in during your time at the State Department? And were there any projects or initiatives left unresolved upon the transition from Trump to Biden? So anyways, let me just simplify this. What was the approach to Africa in the first Trump term, 2017 to 2021?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a simplified version.
And thanks to everyone for turning out. Anything we say today about Trump 2, obviously is going to be pure speculation. I don't think any one of us is up here authoritatively speaking about it. So remember what investment advisors tell their clients, that past performance doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what's going to happen in the future. So please remember that. Before we get to Trump 1, I would just want to talk about just a couple of Africa truisms that cross all administrations, and I predict that they're going to continue at least through the next one as well. Number one, Africa has consistently been the select businesses, but not the overwhelming business community who comes out as constituents for, say, East Asia or Europe. Africa has also been peripheral in that it has mattered in how we deal with third powers, whether it's the Europeans, whether it was the Soviet Union, and now more and more with China. But it's been kind of on the margin of that, and also, and this was highlighted just I think last week or the week before in a phenomenal Reuters article, which pointed out that our African embassies are the most under-resourced, understaffed, and have the longest kind of gaps between assignments, and people in so many of our embassies who are literally everybody's doing their job for the very first time, from the ambassador on down to the most junior officer. So that's kind of how our handling of the continent was when I came in for Trump 1 administration. And one of the things we wanted to do very much is we looked at Africa, said, well, what can we be doing differently in our focus? And we said, okay, Africa is going to be all about the youth. Like it or not, Africa is going to have that youth tsunami. Everybody knows this doubling of the population by 2050 or whatever. So how can we use that? And we were thinking, okay, we can use focusing on the youth as kind of a wedge to work with the African leadership to improve their governance, to improve their business environment, because the youth wanted more than anything else jobs. So, they represented two potentially divergent forces going forward, either a tremendous force for economic dynamism, jobs, consumers, et cetera, or if they were frustrated, a force for instability, increase in extremism, increase in millions of young people heading to Europe. So, we were thinking that we could use that. Unfortunately, some of these other things I just mentioned before really intervened. It's very difficult to implement energetic, new kinds of programs when your embassies are under-resourced, you don't have the budgets. One of the first things I did, I traveled around the continent and I noticed that everywhere the Chinese were there. So I did a survey amongst all of our embassies to look around your country. Tell me, how many positions do you have for the United States Embassy to do trade and investment, as opposed to how many positions does the local Chinese embassy have? Across the board, it was 3 or 4 to 1, sometimes a half, because our economic commercial officer was also doing visa interviews in the morning.
Right.
So right away, that there was a huge disadvantage there. And that was not something that we could ever overcome, even though we had some pretty, great ideas like Prosper Africa and other things like that. But that was just very, very difficult to try to overcome. And we never did, and we still haven't to this day. Then we also saw what we thought were going to be some really good opportunities. Transition was going on in Ethiopia, with Prime Minister Abiy coming to power, Nobel Peace Prize. I think everybody knows that. It was looking great until a couple of weeks before our administration ended. It was like the day after the elections that the internal conflict started between the Tigrayans and the central government. So, what looked very promising totally went down the tubes. And I remember Ramsey when, the Ethiopian promise first came up, and we looked around to see how we could help them when they were looking to help, and we literally looked under every couch cushion.
Yep.
And we came up with almost nothing. And seriously. So that was one. Another one was Democratic Republic of the Congo. Finally got Kabila out, thought that the incoming administration of Tshisekedi had some promise. Initially it did. He was very eager to get U.S. businesses invested in there. Unfortunately, we're not like President Xi. We can't order an American business to go here and start working, unfortunately, but that's just how he works. So again, what started out, I thought very promisingly, but I think by the end of the Trump 1 administration, it was clear that it was not going to go really, really well. And then, of course, the biggest disappointment was Sudan. We had the phenomenal democratic revolution in Sudan, led mostly by Sudanese women. It looked great for a while. We were calling Sudan, not the Horn of Africa, but the hope of Africa. And, when we left, it still looked okay, but now we've seen what happened, and Sudan, without a doubt, is the worst conflict in the world, no matter what you compare it to. And there it doesn't look like it's going to improve anytime soon. So that's kind of a very brief, synopsis, but started out with promise, started out with great ambitions, but then reality hit. And as always seems in Africa, the long-term plans get swamped by the short-term crises. So I'll stop there. I hope I stayed within time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Tibor. And speaking of ambassadors and embassies, I'd like to recognize the ambassadors and embassies we have here in our midst. African ambassadors, I can see Ambassador of Uganda, Morocco, Angola, Namibia, the Ambassador of the African Union. I can also see the Embassy of South Africa, as well as some of the non-African countries or countries in Europe, the UK Embassy, High Commission. Is High Commission or Embassy? I don't know. Yes. Denmark, Norway, among others that I can see from here. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm sure they're going to share their thoughts during the Q&A. Now I want to move over to Ramsey. Trump 1.0. What was your thinking like at the time? What approach did you take, et cetera?
Sure, of course. Well, thank you, Zainab. Thanks for having us, and it's great to be with Frank and my old friend Tibor. Our friendship is old, not you, but it's great to be with everyone, and thanks for coming. I'll keep my comments somewhat specific to USAID, and I think in the first Trump administration, you're right, there was an evolution. I think there are evolutions, I think, in every administration, but perhaps it was a bit more pronounced in the first Trump administration, mainly because I think that it was a bit unclear as to what the utility of USAID was to the administration, and then the priority level of Africa. But I do think that evolved over the course of the 4 years, so much so that I think by the end of the administration, I think Africa played a much more prominent role, still within the context that Tibor, I think, laid out, but still a much more prominent role. And I think there was much more clarity as to how USAID can advance our national strategic and security interests, particularly on the African continent. And I think that was evidenced by probably most notably the Abraham Accords in Sudan and Morocco, notwithstanding all the complications in Sudan now. But at the time, it was, I think, still very, very promising. But also on things like critical minerals that Frank worked on, energy issues that Andy Herskowitz and Power Africa worked on tremendously, and of course countering malign influences, both China and Russia. And so I think it elevated over the course of the administration, and we had a lot of help from great folks in the NSC, Nicole, was very, very helpful in helping to kind of educate the institution, but we had great individuals. So there was certainly an evolution, but I do think by the end of the administration, USAID and Africa played a much more prominent role. And I think what that means is that the learning curve coming in for a second Trump administration will be a lot less steep. And I think we're already seeing the positive benefits of that. I don't think it's going to change in that I don't believe Africa is going to be the top priority on a very, very complicated and crowded priority list. But at the same time, I do think that there's a much greater understanding as to the role of, in my case, USAID, but also the role of Africa. I think in terms of the policy development, we were very, very fortunate to have tremendous leadership in Mark Green at USAID. And our kind of core philosophy and our organizing principle was very, very clear. It was crystal clear under the banner of the Journey to Self-Reliance. And if you're not familiar with that organizing principle, it was the notion that everything that we do should be helping, in this case, an African country, on a path towards self-reliance. And we defined self-reliance as their ability to plan, finance, and implement their own development agenda, hoping to get to a place where we can go from a country being a donor recipient to a partner, and then eventually, and hopefully, to a fellow donor as well. And then all under the organizing principle of ending the need for foreign assistance, meaning the result of what we're doing shouldn't be to perpetuate foreign aid, it should ultimately be to end the need for foreign assistance. So I think, and I know we'll talk about kind of a second Trump administration, so I'll just touch on, I think, a few inevitabilities that I think we will certainly see. One is it will certainly not be business as usual. I think any Trump administration is not going to be business as usual. So I think there should be some expectations for change, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's okay. I do think that there's going to be a greater emphasis on trade and investment, which I'm a big believer in. Maybe it comes in the form of more transactional type of approaches. That sometimes we were just talking about how that sometimes can be used in a derogatory sense, but I don't think it is. Should be used in a derogatory sense. I do believe that the principle of the Journey to Self-Reliance will be reinstated. Maybe that comes in the form, a different name, but I think the organizing principle, I think the general philosophy is likely going to be kind of re-adopted and reintegrated into the process. I also think that there will be a relentless alignment between U.S. national security and strategic interests and every USAID dollar that gets deployed. And I think that'll be across the board and to support administration priorities. So I think that will be something that will be of great focus, is ensuring that every dollar has a job. And that job is to advance our national security and strategic interests, as well as the administration's priorities. And then I do think you mentioned kind of things that perhaps didn't get implemented or maybe were unfinished. And I'll touch quickly on that. As Tibor mentioned, I was really delighted to see that the Biden administration had kind of adopted, put their own signature on the Prosper Africa initiative, which is an initiative to increase two-way trade and investment between the U.S. and Africa. I think that this really should be the cornerstone of our relationship with Africa. I think we need to transition from an aid-based relationship to a relationship that's really rooted in economic collaboration and real partnership. So I think that was, it's not an unfinished item, but I think it's something that will be continue to be pursued, and I was really delighted to see the Biden administration do great work on it. I think British Robinson and her team have done terrific work. Shout out to the Africa Bureau for all the work that you've done. So, and then I do think initiatives like the New Partnership Initiative that was started in the Trump administration, which was an effort to expand our partner base, I think may come in a different form, may have a new name to it, but I think this is something that is absolutely critical that USAID diversify its partnerships. As we move into the world of AI, we've got to figure out a way to engage technology companies both on the African continent and in the U.S. and most of these companies simply are not government contractors. And so we can talk about procurement reform and what that looks like. So I'll leave that perhaps to a later part of the discussion. But I do think it's an important part of the discussion. And then lastly, this is something that's a little more personal, something that I would like to see, which is a U.S.-Africa Business Summit. I think there was tremendous goodwill that was built out of the U.S.-Africa Leader Summit in 2014. And I think it would be very consistent with at least the first Trump administration priorities to have a business summit. I tried.
Yeah.
Didn't happen. We kind of ran out of time, but I do think it's something that I think is important. But that's certainly not an inevitability, but I do think it's important to do.
Great. Well, hoping this U.S.-Africa Business Summit idea comes to life. Thanks a lot, Ramsey. I want to bring in Frank. And Frank, same question to you. Trump 1.0. What was your thinking in the position you occupied as the inaugural Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, to the extent that the work that you did affected Africa or even the Global South? Mm-hmm. Ramsey mentioned transactional, and I know we had a conversation about that word. I wonder if you would want to share some of your thoughts on that front with our colleagues here.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll come back to that.
Okay.
I guess just to start from the beginning, in terms so my role was running U.S. energy diplomacy, and I came from the mining industry before, oil and gas and mining, before I was in government, and so I looked at it through that lens. And taking the job, it was also 8 years after the Obama administration, where celebration of the Paris Climate Accord, and everything was climate and clean energy, and so we came into office, of course, at an interesting time in terms of the arc of U.S. domestic energy production, eventually becoming the largest oil and gas producer in the world. And these countries, when I would travel to Africa, many countries would want to develop their indigenous resources, oil and gas resources in particular, and there was that was kind of put down during most of the Obama administration because they wanted to move to this energy transition. There was almost this thinking, a bit academic perhaps, that you would leapfrog the development of fossil energy resources that are domestic to develop a clean economy, and so African countries wouldn't have to go through that period of time. They could just go to the better solution. The reality, though, when my conversations with many government ministers when I was in the job was very negatively received, and it was a sense of you are coming to us to tell us how you wish we would live versus meeting us where we are. I had one minister actually was so upset about kind of the anti-investment push and the support for ESG type of based investments that he remarked that all of you, meaning Western investors, focus on ESG means that my people and my country can get to breathe clean air in the dark, which I thought was quite a powerful visual to consider. So of course, coming from the business world and doing investment, I worked on oil projects in West Africa in a number of countries. One of the challenges is companies go to invest, but there's lots of choices, and a lot of governments will say, well, you should come and invest here because we have good rocks or good reservoirs for oil or gas. But again, this came at a time when the capital was coming to the United States. The shale revolution was in full swing. And so to try to encourage companies to go and invest in Africa was challenging because they had optionality. Also, I think it was also important to recognize with that ascension of the U.S. oil and gas patch, the recognition that there's more countries, African nations, who are members of OPEC than the Middle East, even though the Middle East dominates the narrative. And so there was this kind of tussle within the private sector and within the Trump 1.0 on some of that engagement. One of the things that I saw, though, is that whether from the lens of climate change and accelerating the clean energy transition for clean tech manufacturing, or from the perspective of security, supply chain integrity, and supporting the industrial base, the U.S. needed to address its lack of a critical mineral supply chain. And of course, Africa really is showing itself to be kind of the swing producer, will be in that regard. So we needed to change our thinking. We needed to have a new kind of economic engagement with the continent, and how to do that, and where can we have a degree of a relationship between both parties. But again, we still had that overhang of either actual or perception about investing in African countries, corruption risk, and all of these other things that corporates just wouldn't go there. So one of the things that I led was the creation of a multilateral focus on developing under the rubric of good governance, called the Energy Resource Governance Initiative. It was a multilateral conversation amongst governments, not coming to tell other countries in the global south on how they should operate, but taking input from multiple countries and what is best practice based on very diverse histories, rules of law, et cetera. And one of the cornerstone companies or countries that was in that effort was Botswana. And so we developed, the concept here was to create a toolkit to understand what is best practice. Then the U.S. State Department would fund development assistance, technical assistance to help implement the toolkit. And then thirdly, we sought to mobilize international finance through the Development Finance Corporation, that if a country was mobilizing this, they should have a preference in terms of an investment case. That was going well. Of course, then COVID happened, and it all kind of ground to a bit of a halt. But what I was seeking to do was dispel this reputational cloud to make these countries make a best-in-class investor, which the countries themselves really want. Like, let's get away from this perception and let's demonstrate why this is a good investment case for the company, but also for the country. And that goes back to the point about transaction. I read, and maybe this is going to 2.0, but this concept of the Trump administration, Trump, is very transactional, and it's described in media and think tank land as a really derogatory approach. And I think we should test that. I think that having a transactional approach is highly appropriate, and I think it's consistent with your points, Randy, about the road to the journey of self-reliance, because only then it's really teaching a man to fish rather than giving them one. And if you engage with a counterparty and both sides know what is expected, what each contribution is, and how each should be held to account, I think that changes the discussion, and everyone really is a partner in that endeavor, versus this kind of asymmetry of the U.S. should just come in and provide grants for some kind of health or humanitarian. It's well-intentioned, but there isn't the same kind of reciprocity and the development of the local content and really job creation if there's not skin in the game, if there's not, both sides aren't really getting something out of this. So I think we ought to approach transactional approach, albeit on its head, because only then can you really achieve that, but where both sides walk away and feel fulfilled.
Yeah, right on.
That is fantastic and very thought-provoking. I'm sure people are going to have more thoughts to share during the Q&A. But this is a very good segue into talking about Trump 2.0. What should we expect in your respective domains? Tibor, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, there are certain things that are kind of immutable when it comes to Africa policy and the way Africa is approached in the U.S. So should we expect significant continuities on that front? Are there things that could likely change? Are there things that you would like to see? Also, maybe this is an important platform to talk about maybe for all of us to come up with a wish list. This could be great when it comes to US-Africa engagement. So however which way you want to address that question,
Okay.
Trump 2.0.
All right, very good. All right, independent of, we did our notes ahead of time without consulting, and my number one was also newsflash. It's going to be transactional. I think that, that we can definitely predict. I'm also very much hoping that it's going to be much more realistic and pragmatic. I mean, one of the things I have said for years now is that China makes deals and America gives lectures. I think we absolutely have to put the megaphone down in dealing with our African partners. And we also, I think, are going to have to be honest about, yes, it is very much about global power competition. Incoming Secretary of State, hopefully to be confirmed, Rubio, he himself has said that from his point of view, our adversarial relationship with China may be the most significant adversary that America ever has faced in our history. And then, of course, with Russian troublemaking. So it's going to be very much about that. And it's going to be very much about critical or strategic minerals. I don't think that we can pretend otherwise, because that's something else that I think is a red line for the United States of America, is to not allow an adversary to have overall total control or majority control of commodities and minerals that we need in our key sectors, whether it's in 21st century technology or weapon systems. So I think that is going to be very important. Then you cannot get away from the 3 C's: crises, conflicts, and coups. Obviously, you find that when you're Assistant Secretary for Africa and the phone rings, that displaces everything else. And looking around Africa, unfortunately, we have way too many of those. Sudan is worse today than the day the crisis started. Ethiopia, gone through the Tigray crisis, crises in Oromia, now Amhara. Something that could have been the stability in the Horn of Africa is exporting instability. And then, of course, the Great Lakes. Those are going to require high-level attention because, as we saw in Sudan, where you have special envoys tripping over each other and conference after conference, and almost the statement of the week coming out of Washington, probably to make Washington feel better than to accomplish anything. In effect, nothing has been accomplished. Then we have to deal with coups, and I think here it's going to be very critical to take a little bit nuanced difference and maybe look at each individual coup instead of painting them all with a broad brush and saying bad. We're not going to deal with you, because sometimes, as we have found in some of these countries, there is no legitimate way to change a government that has ensconced themselves in power through corrupt elections, changing the Constitution, tremendous frustration on the part of the people. So I think perhaps we should be looking at the word legitimacy, legitimacy in the eyes of the people, as opposed to some amorphous democracy that nobody can really define. And maybe a government needs to be engaged with and to have their hands held exactly when some kind of a transition happens. We have seen, I'm not going to get into specifics, but disasters of U.S. policy in how we have dealt with some of those governments. And also, of course, the youth. Get back to the youth. You can't help but deal with the youth. And they're won jobs. And whether you have a corrupt dictatorship or a model democracy, those heads of state can look out there and they can look around their population. I mean, some of these capital cities, you can feel the anger on the streets from the part of young people who won jobs. And I think, again, that we can use the idea of working with American trade and investment to help African youth get jobs, which is something that Chinese projects may not lead to, but the kind of projects we do might. Be very interested to see how the Lobito Corridor project turns out. So with that, I will stop.
Okay.
Turn it back.
All right, I have a lot of follow-up questions, but I'm also mindful of time, and I want to give our friends who are here the chance to weigh in. Ramsey, from 2.0, what to
Predictions.
expect,
Yeah.
what is on your wish list?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I do believe that when I was the assistant administrator for Africa, my number one priority, and always will be, was the health and safety of all of our staff on the team and our partners and all of that. And but putting that aside, my second priority was really to advance and evolve the relationship between the U.S. and Africa from, as I mentioned, an aid-based relationship to one that's really rooted in economic collaboration. And I think that will hold true, I think, in the second Trump administration, at least I certainly hope so. And in many ways, I think every USAID dollar should have one of two jobs. One, either advancing and establishing that African country as an economic destination for American and international investment. Now, underneath that, I'll unpack that just a little bit. Or leveraging and catalyzing U.S. investment into that particular country. So one of the two. But in the first one, that doesn't mean, so before everyone says I don't like humanitarian assistance or particularly with Rob in the room, or health or anything like that, to be able to establish a country as an economic destination for American investment, you need a lot of the work that the bread and butter work that USAID does. You need a safe, healthy, and capable workforce. You need a functioning judicial system. You need transparency. You need some anti-corruption measures in many cases to deal with some of the perceived or real corruption issues. You need a whole host of elements to create that destination. The whole concept of economic convergence, of establishing an investment opportunity and then linking those to investment mechanisms. So I think that is something we will certainly see as a prioritization on engaging the private sector. I do think that, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, we've got to engage non-traditional USAID partners. And this is hard work, this is complex work, this is procurement reform, but at the same time, we are looking at what I think the advent of artificial intelligence and the digital transformation on the continent, I think, is going to be akin to the introduction of the internet. It will be as impactful. And I think if we ignore that, then that is going to be to the detriment of U.S. national strategic and security interests. And so if we don't engage in shaping that ecosystem and that landscape, then others will, particularly China, and China already is. So I do think that we need to be able to engage in shaping that ecosystem, but to do so, in the sense of USAID has got to be able to engage non-traditional partners. I'll give you a quick example, and I'm sure I can get fact-checked by several of the USAID folks in the room, but in many cases, the technical evaluation committee panels, the tech panels, the criteria for awards might be 50, 60, 70% based on past performance and key personnel. That is all based on essentially crowding out anyone who has not been a high-level USAID contractor, means that they can't compete. And AI companies, both Africa, and technology companies, both African and American, simply they're not US government contractors. And so on a scale of 1 to 100, they're 50 or 60 points behind on the very first thing. And so it's very difficult for USAID to engage many of these partners. That needs to be changed. And there needs to be ways in which the agency can engage partners. Well, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about localization, so it bleeds into that. But procurement reform will be, I think, a critical element to being able to get the right partners in. And it's not to knock the existing implementing partners, but they have never been forced to innovate to survive. And they need to be able to innovate in this new world. And I think that's what our African partners are looking for, and I think that's what USAID has to deliver.
Great. We'll definitely come back to that localization, procurement reform, and the use of US dollars effectively. Frank, Trump 2.0.
Yeah, well, firstly, I think Randy's applying for a job
Ramsey.
with the
Ramsey.
sorry,
That's
Ramsey,
all right.
applying with the job for the Elon Musk commission. I'd like to see that. That's good. I'd like to save a lot of money. Yeah, so I think going back to the organizing principle, every government, every administration has an organizing principle, and under the Biden administration, it's been climate change. And when you have an organizing principle, it leads to certain policy prescriptions and prioritization. And I think that Trump 2.0 will have a similar organizing principle as 1.0, which is that's security. And that will be the guiding principle. And that leads into energy security, critical minerals, supply chain security. And that will be approach. It also will be less, the approach will be more meeting countries where they are. What is this, we talk a lot about self-determination, but your point about America has a megaphone versus investments or something, yeah, I think that's very well put. I think you're going to see a lot more of focus on real investments, real mobilization of capital, and what are the constraints that are preventing that from happening? Because a lot of the countries on the continent want U.S. investment. Why are they not getting it? And what can government do to help make those investments more attractive? And I think that there should be that kind of a deliberate. I think that's the role of government. The government doesn't do much. It's the private sector that actually takes action. The government can establish parameters for action, but it's really about capital mobilization and deploying that capital in an appropriate way that we need to create the guidance for. And that's the role, I think, of government. I think you also see, you mentioned if confirmed. My gosh, I'm haunted by that. If confirmed.
We know that well.
But Secretary of State Rubio, I'd also like to point out, if confirmed, Secretary of Energy Wright, who's written extensively on this. Pretty thoughtful choice by President Trump, and in particular, his focus. First he acknowledges man-made climate change, so okay, tick. But he also thinks that rather than focus on net zero, a far more important and achievable objective would be the eradication of energy poverty. And I think that that's certainly something that would resonate strongly in Africa, given that's where, unfortunately, where so much energy poverty exists. So what does that mean? How can that be mobilized? Back to that investment thesis, and creating the conditions for that kind of investment. I also think that there's going to be a true point about self-determination. What if someone wants to eradicate energy poverty in their country? What do they want? Rather than us lecturing. I think that will be really a key point. And that goes back to, I think you mentioned AGOA earlier. AGOA, oil is included in AGOA. Should critical minerals be included in AGOA? I think that's an appropriate thing to raise. We should talk about that. Why or why not? What does AGOA actually get a country, by the way? It's not always clear to me, other than it's better to be in than out. But I think, let's make this, rather than I think there'll be a focus more on delivery rather than talking. There are plenty of well-intentioned convenings of countries, but the press release and the MOU doesn't help get tons out of the ground. What needs to happen? Back to actually, let's think about that. Of course, you mentioned the geopolitical competition. Of course, the China challenge, the asymmetry with which China invests through debt versus how America, the U.S. government money rather, invests. Really, most of that's grants and through the humanitarian purposes. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but the way in which the amount of money that the relatively modest amount of money in support of countries that China has versus their own economic interests, I think that should be disclosed. We should talk about that. And there's a degree of transparency. Hopefully that not the U.S. should stop humanitarian support, but I think what do the countries get out of some of these investments? And then, I think we should consider, by the way, you mentioned the China made some kind of announcement about some trade.
Yes, given the least developed countries in the
Yes.
world, 33 of which are in Africa,
Yes.
duty-free access to its market from December.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was just reflecting on that because most commodities, there's no duty. So it's like I'm going to make an announcement. Look, you have duty-free access to my country, but my state SOEs in your continent already export duty-free because commodities are rarely as a duty imposed. So we need to think about what exactly is on offer here. Don't get excited. Let's look at what's really on offer. And then I was reflecting on, we talk about the continent the minerals abundance, but the level of under exploration. And I think that's a real opportunity for the U.S. government to mobilize some technical support if countries want it, to help with mapping of what is the geologic endowment in certain countries or certain areas of certain countries. We had a program in Greenland, for example, where we had an MOU and deployed some resources to do various studies, in particular looking at rare earth concentrations in certain areas of Greenland. The U.S. government, in exchange for that, had a 2-year option with the data to figure out what it would want to do. Again, maybe that's transactional, but there's also both sides get something out of the deal. So that's something else I would think, in terms of a quick win, the administration could look at to have some partnership with certain countries.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to open up shortly, but 2 points you made, and I kind of wanted to build on them because we've got active lines of work there. One is on AGOA. Last year we published a paper on U.S. clean energy supply chains and how African countries can participate. And we're one of the first set of analysts to make the case that AGOA should be leveraged to increase the trade in critical minerals between the U.S. and Africa. And now it's a conversation that has really gained momentum in DC, and we'll see whether that really comes to happen. The second is with respect to the U.S. providing, whether it's technical assistance or supporting African countries with geological surveys and mapping. Again, is something that we've been pushing for as well here in the Carnegie Africa Program. Because when you think about it, the reality is there aren't a lot of U.S. companies, U.S. mining companies. There's a different discussion to be had in terms of how to even, quote unquote, compete with or counter China with respect to critical minerals if the U.S. does not have mining companies. A lot of the companies are Canadian or British or European or Australian. So that technical assistance, whether through the Department of Energy or USGS, Department of Interior, might be something tangible that would be valued by a lot of African countries, but that also benefits the US. So just a few thoughts I wanted to share to reinforce a point that you just made. Now I want to open up for Q&A. We have about maybe 20 minutes. We will take maybe 3 or so per round, and then we'll come back. And when you ask your question, please introduce yourself and then make it very brief so that we can accommodate as many as possible. The gentleman over, okay. That's it. And then.
Yeah, hi. My name's John Vanden Heuvel. My company's called Small Farm Cities Africa. We're developing special economic zones for small farmers. I call it Dubai for the little guy. My question really relates to if there's been any consideration on the part of the U.S. in terms of developing special economic zones, kind of taking that approach. And I refer to this, actually, I worked with DP World for a number of years and in Dubai and in Africa. And I'm very interested in the single window approach, the technology, the technological integration, and the transactional nature, both imports, exports, or re-exports. But a single window approach, because honestly, even though I have a master's from Johns Hopkins, I'm an investor in Africa and I can't navigate there's probably 10 different sort of options. That means there's 0 as a practical matter because the average American investor just doesn't have the time to spend understanding sort of these things. So whether it's DFC or USAID or any of the other XMs, so forth, just wondering if there's been any thought to organizing sort of a single window platform, special economic zone approach for U.S. policy moving forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone here before we?
Yeah.
Okay.
I-
So we'll
Oh,
just
you
take
need
two
three.
more,
Oh,
and
okay.
then, yeah. Okay, yeah, Mel, and then the lady at the back.
Hi, Mel Foot, Constituency for Africa. My question is, what do we expect about traditional government initiatives for Africa? I'm thinking about YALI. I'm thinking about AGOA. I'm thinking about the U.S.-Africa Summit. Should we expect some changes in these traditional programs facing for Africa?
Okay, the lady at the back, and then we'll come back to the speakers.
Hello, everyone. I'm Fatimata Belem. I'm a former staff of the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Mali. So my question would be a bit related to that. U.S. presence on the international arena, particularly with the United Nations. Because we have seen that with Trump 1, we had the U.S. pull out from, for instance, the United Nations Human Rights Council, and all others, move to defund the United Nations. So my question would be, how could we see a Trump 2 working actively on those arena to really have an impact on good governance in Africa, human right, respect for human rights, as well as democratic institution? Because I think, okay.
Thank
Sorry.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Like,
you.
we got the
Okay.
question, yeah.
Yes, we got the question.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you want me to do, okay. First of all, with the single source, that was,
Yes,
and
single
Ramsey
window.
can,
Yeah, he can do
confirm
that.
on that. But that was the whole idea for Prosper Africa, was to serve as because we've been lecturing African governments for decades about, having a one-stop shop, guichet unique, what everyone, and the dirty secret was that we had, I forgot, 23 agencies or something involved in Africa, and we didn't have a single. That was the whole idea. Unfortunately, it came late in the administration. We were never able to develop it. And then again, going back to the resources at our embassies in Africa, because it was a two-way deal. It was easy enough to try to focus everything on this side, but then the U.S. embassies are supposed to support it on that side. We introduced the deal teams.
Yep, that's right.
I don't know if that's been really carried forward, but you could see renewed focus on that. And I hope that it will be taken forward because it's very much in the U.S. interest. And now very quickly, and I'll leave the traditional one to somebody else, but on the multilateral agencies and organizations, I think with Trump 2, you will see that what the president sees as serving and helping the interests of the United States will be supported. If it's an agency that is anathema to the interests of the United States, and say a Human Rights Commission that has North Korea or Iran on it, I think the United States will drop out. But there's a contravening force there, especially with Africa, because Africa has such a large membership, and often they tend to vote in consensus with each other. So there's also that. How valuable is that agency to the United States of America? There are going to be no punches pulled in Trump 2, So get ready for that. And I'll turn it over for the others.
I concur.
I can do some rapid fire
Okay.
on a couple of these. John, I think, commend you for the initiative, and I think special economic zones are really interesting. They could be certainly very helpful. And I would also preface all of this by saying these are just my own opinions. I'm not a representative of the incoming administration, so this is obviously quite a bit of speculation. But I think agriculture is also going to be yet another kind of sector that is going to have a high level of priority from the USAID side for a whole host of reasons, because I think there's tremendous mutual benefit. And I think that probably very well could be one of the cornerstones of kind of the overall effort of two-way trade and investment. I mean, I think on AGOA and the U.S. Business Summit, Personally, on AGOA, I would like to see it reauthorized. I would like to see it modernized. I think a cut and paste from 2015, I don't think makes a whole lot of sense. I think there are multiple elements and components that need to be integrated into a reauthorization, but I also think it would be a geostrategic gift to China if we were to not reauthorize AGOA. But I do think digital trade, I think critical minerals, I think all of those should kind of be on the table when it comes to those negotiations. And then on multilateralism, I will echo Tibor's comments in that the challenge that I think the second Trump administration will see is that there's an effectiveness problem when it comes to public international organizations, PIOs. A lot of USAID money goes to PIOs, and in many cases, we don't get a lot to show for it. And in some cases, some of those organizations are not working in the interest of U.S. national interests. And so there's a lack of trust, and there's some real skepticism. Now, that's a blanket statement. And so there are several organizations that I think will continue to be strong supporters and implementers of USAID dollars. I think the World Food Program has done terrific work. But there are a lot that simply have not been effective. And I don't believe that you're going to see this notion that we are going to continue doing what we did simply because we did it last year.
That's right.
Yep.
That, I think you can anticipate, will be thrown out the window. And so I think multilateralism, it will be a complex issue, and it won't be monolithic. There will be some that will have continued partnership, and I think some will simply be moved on.
Okay, I'll come back to Frank, but let's take on a few more questions. And yes, I was going to call on the honorable ambassadors, Ambassador Robbie, and maybe...
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, I'm putting you on the spot.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm Robi Kakonge, Uganda's ambassador. As we think about reauthorization, Uganda is quite frankly thinking about getting back on the list because of something that they wanted repealed, and it's a bit of a long story. But what's the likelihood? Clean sheet or no clean sheet?
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other ambassadors? Ambassador Hilda?
Thank you very much, Zainab, for inviting us, and thank you for these thought-provoking presentations. And I would want to say Africa is at that stage at the moment, which is totally different. It's actually evolving. It's getting better. Mm-hmm. It's shaping itself to be a force to reckon with, let alone being a member of the G20. A child will not start by jumping. They will start by crawling, and they will get there. We have been yearning as Africa to be on the world stage. Yes, that's where we are right now. But I want to say African Union has come up with policy frameworks which will allow us to relate. We have Agenda 2063, and it's got its flagships, which AFCFTA, which has now a memorandum of understanding. Mm-hmm. And all these are efforts to show, and also efforts to say, this is where we are, and this is where we want to go. And having AFCFTA tasked with integration of the whole of Africa, what are we saying? We're looking at it, doing business with you. I see a ray of light in this administration. And I congratulate President Trump, and also for him to look at Africa with a different eye and to say, it's Africa today, which we have today. You talked of the coups, and you said maybe we have to look at each and every country and really assess and see, as long as we work together, as you take that effort, we work together in that assessment because we know the underlying issues that may be dealing each and every country. We have the youth, bulging youth, which is on the continent at the moment. I thank you so much for saying you are looking to work with this youth to make a difference, because this idea of immigrations, these challenges of these young people crossing borders, going, then it will be ameliorated, let me put it that way, because we'll have to work together for this security. and a peace to develop, for the development to happen. And we look forward to working with the Trump administration. And I see a ray of light. My name is Hilda, ambassador of the African Union in the U.S. Thank you.
Any of the other ambassadors? I think, yes. Angola? Honorable Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you, from Angola, Ambassador. Just a few questions. The Biden administration have been pushing for Lobito corridor, not only by, it's important to bilateral relationship, but also for the region and also for the critical mineral. So I'd like to tell us more about the Lobito corridor importance for the next administration.
Okay. Let's take those ones. We'll come back.
He'll do
Yes.
the Lobito corridor, but
Yeah.
on AGOA reauthorization, I think it's very important for everybody to remember, if you read the initial AGOA Act, it was meant, number one, not as a trade deal, but as a foreign policy tool of the United States of America to use as a carrot with those countries whose policies were aligning with our interests. And so it's been used in the past, like, for example, when the United States kicked Ethiopia off AGOA, I was not in the administration. I was against that, because what that did was put an awful lot of Ethiopian women out of work. But it was a way to send a message that the administration was very unhappy with Ethiopia. So we'll see. You know, I can't speak for how President Trump will look at it, but everybody has to remember that, number one, AGOA was passed as a foreign policy tool, and then the economic benefits came out of that. So that's important, especially for African countries to understand. And I'll kick it over on Lobito to.
Yeah, Frank?
Yeah, I think the Lobito corridor is kind of a grand experiment, and it's one of the challenges we have is from the U.S. perspective generally is that where do you start in terms of Africa relative to what's available to invest in. What doesn't already have a prohibitive amount of Chinese interference, control, or ownership. What I mean by control is also could be perhaps they don't own the mine, but they own 100% off the offtake. Perhaps they don't own either. They have some kind of a joint venture, but they own and control all the surrounding infrastructure. They control the power, they control rail, they control all the other stuff. So where does one start? If you see kind of a map and it's just, Chinese flags everywhere. I think that Lobito corridor is a bold move. It's something that I think is worthwhile to continue to develop very much. I think the binding issue here is other corollary investments, but you need to start with something. And so I think it's a meaningful start. Much more needs to be done, but that's the vision of it, right? Is to start somewhere, and then build around it and create an ecosystem, build its power, create other infrastructure to move along the corridor. It starts with a rail line, but it has the promise, the opportunity set to be so much more. So I think the more business, private sector continues to speak in favor of it, I think that will should kind of win the day in the end. I think that the Trump administration would approach it with a degree of pragmatism. If something's private sector led, it's going to be that's going to be substantive into the decision making process. So that's how I would approach it. I think we got to start somewhere, and I think it's a meaningful start.
Okay, we'll take the final round of questions. Go ahead.
My name is Ben. I'm in mining sector. I kind of liked what the ambassador talked about, in terms of China. I've seen it, in DRC. And my question to all of you, how do you think the U.S. is going to approach the aggressivity of China that has really the hold on the neck of all the mining sector, not only in DRC, but across Africa? Thank you.
Thanks. The gentleman here, And then those two, and then Steve, and that's it.
Thank you. My name is Nevi Makonnen. I am the Director of Government Relations at Amhara Association of America, based here in the U.S. That's focused on informing members of Congress, State Department, human rights organizations, and international media on the human rights violations and war crimes being committed on the Amhara people in Ethiopia. And I'm sure, Tibor Nagy, Ambassador, you've been following Ethiopia, for a long time and know that, for the past year and a half, there's been a full-on war that's been going on, been waged on the Amhara people in Ethiopia with complete communication blackout. We have documented that just in the last 2 months, over 50 drone strikes have been reported in the Amhara region, killing over 200 civilians, with BBC Amharic reporting last week that just in one area in Ajafar, Gojam region of Amhara, over 50 civilians were killed, pregnant women in clinics and hospitals, markets were bombed by drones, and we've seen a lot of atrocities. I know, Biden's administration has said, human rights would be at the forefront, and we've noticed it's been very selective, not just internationally, but even within Ethiopia, on how the Biden administration approached the human rights violations in Tigray compared to what's going on in Amhara now. So my question to you is, like you mentioned earlier, the Trump administration would be more, realistic and more transactional, and human rights might not be at the front. So my question is, how do you think the Trump administration coming in will handle Ethiopia? Because the current trajectory is not sustainable with things getting close to imploding. So how do you see Trump administration approaching this? And how do you see the role that UAE is playing
Got
in
it.
the Horn of Africa
Thank you.
and Ethiopia?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Those two gentlemen over there. I saw two hands.
My name is Nagy Musa. I work with PACT, and I'm also from Sudan. My question is also kind of similar, like the move from more like human rights or value-based kind of approach to a transactional kind of approach, especially in countries where there is proxy wars now happening and taking place, where we have mercenary groups and militias taking over the mining sector. Is this going to lead to more kind of destabilization in Africa, and how we can ensure that also like the human rights are still protected? This is one question. The other question is more.
No, it's just one. Just one. Sorry, just one. Thank you.
Nice try there.
The final question from that side. Just one. We can only do one. Yeah.
Oh, for me or?
Whoever it is, I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. East Africa's, got really excited at the end of the session. So my question really is similar to what both these gentlemen asked, but also as far as, my name is Betty Tekesta. I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. You all mentioned, and I like the way the gentleman said, every dollar has a job with USAID and what's going forward. There's been several, and I forget the name of it, but there's USAID programs like resilience programs and such that are around agriculture and development and that sort of stuff that actually, have created a lot of dependency and such like that. How do you see, I guess, going forward in Trump 2.0, these kind of programs? Is there a way to curtail them or like revise them and add, other sorts of programs to stop just funding relentlessly without seeing any results for the people? That's my
Great.
question.
Just one final question from Stephen.
Wow.
That's it. Trying to get all of them. You
We've
don't
got
have
an
to answer
hour's
all of
worth
them,
of
but
questions
yeah.
here.
Go ahead.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I will be a New Yorker and limit myself to 5 point, but only 2 sentence a point, but really hear from you. Okay. Number
Can you
one,
make
and
2
most
points?
I'll be really short.
Yeah.
Trust me. I
Okay.
know how to be short. But number one, AGOA, and so on. AGOA must be renewed. I view it as a trade initiative coming from GSP and given to USTR, so you and I can debate. But what we must do is end the conditions. It must be an economic program focusing on economy, none of this human rights stuff. It doesn't belong in the other sanctions. 2, the administration must appoint a czar, a businessman, to run U.S. policy with Africa and make it transactional. That's definitely a requirement. 3, we must look at laws like Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, laws against money laundering, et cetera, et cetera. We cannot have investors suddenly worrying about violating various rules, and everybody's been scared to take them on. Last point, really quickly put. I'm the kind of person like Africa. I never knew whether I was going to be chosen or not to participate in a sporting event. I used to pray there was an even number, but if it was an odd number of people, I was out. I then won 2 major letters in college and high school football. You know how I did that? You know what position I was? Water boy. That's what I learned the secret for Africa. Be creative. So I got my major leagues for being, they called it a manager, but it was a water boy. Thank you very much.
Can't top that.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, we have just 1 minute to go.
Oh, yeah, plenty of time.
This is also an opportunity for you to give your closing remarks. If you want to close your remarks by addressing a question,
Sure.
or I leave it up to you. So,
Sure. Perhaps I'll just quickly address,
Okay.
but I will make it lightning fast.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, Betty, I think the question was around programs that don't work or programs that don't have clear metrics for success. And I think you are going to hear that a lot in the second Trump administration. There's going to be a litmus test as to, is this program advancing our administration priorities, our national strategic and security priorities? If it doesn't meet that test, then yeah, it's going to go under scrutiny. Now, as most people know in this room, every dollar that USAID has is appropriated by Congress, and it has its own job coming from Congress. And so that's, I think, one of the challenges is I think there will have to be a very strong and robust relationship between the U.S. government, the executive branch, and the Hill to ensure that everything is kind of is aligned. But we are not going to aid Africa out of poverty. The private sector is going to do that. Mm-hmm. And so if USAID can leverage its dollars to catalyze private sector investment and trade and increased economic activity, treat African countries like adults. They want to be integrated into the international economic system. We can play a role in helping that, but it is not going to be aid that is going to fix the challenges that Africa is facing. So.
Frank?
Yeah, just real quick on just programs, I just want to underscore, bold, and italicize your comments about outcomes. I mean, what are the KPIs for programs? If they're not well defined, then they shouldn't be there. When I was at the department, they would say, "Oh, Mr. Secretary, you don't understand. Diplomacy is nuanced." And I said, "Okay, but what are we trying to achieve? Like, we need clarity of mission, and then we can all drive toward that. And bumps in the road will happen, but we have to be clear on that. So I think that will be a guiding principle. On the mining question, you're exactly right. The Chinese, while the U.S. and countries have good talks and discussions, the Chinese Belt and Road investment, specifically in mining metals, in 2022 to 2023, increased 158%. While we're talking, they're deploying capital and building things and locking up resource. So I think that what are we going to do about it? There will be a pretty intensive effort to mobilize capital and get in there. Your point, there aren't a lot of U.S. mining companies. No, they're not. There are Western mining companies, but there are some sophisticated, world-leading U.S. mining-based investors. And so it doesn't actually have to be an American that holds the shovel. It could be an African holding the shovel, but it could be a U.S. investor supporting that African holding the shovel. So I think that we have a clarity on the purpose, and there's an opportunity set if we're welcomed in the countries.
Okay. My view, public lectures and megaphones will not necessarily solve human rights problems. The way you would solve Sudan, you have two people, General Hamedi, General Burhan, and you have to put pressure on them. How do you put pressure on them? With President Sisi on Burhan and MBS and UAE with Hamedi, and go with a ceasefire, not with envoys running all over the place and having conferences. That's Ethiopia. You resolve that by putting pressure on Prime Minister Abiy to have a real national reconciliation process. But for them to have a real reconciliation process, they also have to have somebody to speak with. And as we know, the Fano groups are not all together. So that again has to have a process, but you need high-level involvement, not issuing a public statement every day that doesn't achieve anything except make you feel good.
Well, I think that's a very good note to end this conversation on. This is not the end, but this is only the end of the beginning. Sorry, that's a little cheesy, but I couldn't help it. But thank you very much to our esteemed panelists. Thank you very much to our guests. And there's more to come. This is only the beginning.
Really good match.
Yeah, enjoy that.
Just like
and
our
thanks to
congressional.
colleagues in particular and the entire team. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.